The hearing will come to order. Today's hearing of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee is entitled Learning from VA Whistleblowers. Our committee is constantly exploring ways to improve the accessibility, quality, and safety of veterans' health care, create a more timely and accurate review of benefit applications, and reduce instances of waste, fraud, and abuse in the department. One of the best sources of information and ideas is the VA's 370,000 employees, the people at the front lines for delivering services to veterans. Unfortunately, VA seems to have a culture problem. In some instances, VA leadership and supervisors have turned a blind eye to those in VA's workforce that have pointed out serious problems or attempted to expose bad actors that have abused their positions or broken laws. In even more concerning examples, VA leadership and supervisors have actively worked to stamp out these voices. As you will hear from one of our witnesses today, VA informed her just yesterday of its intention to terminate her employment. The timing of VA's notice, just one day before this hearing, is suspicious at best, and at worst, reeks of retaliation. Make no mistake, this committee believes in the importance of having people who are brave enough to stand up and blow the whistle on missteps and misdeeds within the Department of Veterans Affairs. Anyone involved in the veterans policy arena will recall the difference that can be made by whistleblowers if they think back 5 years. In 2014, a group of people working for the Phoenix VA Medical Center exposed the existence of a secret waiting list of veterans in need of medical care. Thousands of veterans were waiting months upon months for appointments. However, as was later revealed in an independent VA Inspector General audit, more than 70% of the veterans who were waiting for care from the Phoenix VA were excluded from the VA's official count. Worse, the Phoenix VA leadership actively worked to hide the exorbitant wait times, and it turned out that such practices were occurring at VA facilities nationwide. The cover-up was extensive and deliberate, and the health and well-being of veterans were at risk. Congress became involved passing laws to stop secret lists and requiring that the wait times faced by veterans will be published online for everyone to see. But there was a cost. As you will hear from another of today's witnesses, the Phoenix VA employees who blew the whistle in 2014 have faced retaliation. Their jobs were threatened, and they faced a hostile work environment. Despite our witness's initial success in obtaining protection and reinstatement as an employee, she is once again facing retaliation. Fortunately, VA whistleblowers continue to come forward. Just last month, journalists reported about a whistleblower with evidence suggesting VA is still hiding veterans' wait times. This subcommittee is currently conducting its own investigation to examine the facts surrounding these new allegations. Whistleblowers are too important a resource to ignore. Their rights must be protected so that future whistleblowers will have confidence that their stories will be heard and assurance that their allegations will be investigated without reprisal. There are several institutions in place to help protect whistleblowers. Most recently, in 2017, Congress and VA established a new Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection, and 2 years later, it's time to see if this new VA office is effective. Unfortunately, as you will hear from our first panel, there's evidence suggesting that problems continue. Let me be clear. As this subcommittee's chairman, I will fight for the rights of whistleblowers. The work of the VA is too important to ignore those pointing out the missteps and misdeeds. I also want to say that there are some examples of VA eventually successfully listening to whistleblowers without retaliating against them. At the Manchester VA Medical Center in my district, Dr. Ed Coyce and his colleagues saw serious problems threatening the health of veterans. At first, he went to his supervisors, but Dr. Coyce was ignored. He continued pressing these issues to higher and higher authorities within the VA. He was still ignored. Finally, he went to the Boston Globe's investigative journalism team and to Congress. And finally, the VA took his allegations seriously and began working to address the patient safety and quality of care concerns that Dr. Coyce and his colleagues identified. This is good news that Dr. Coyce says he has not experienced retaliation as a result of speaking out. And I urge the VA to follow the path of New Hampshire's example when other whistleblowers express their concerns. Let's not be naive, however. The success story we saw in my home state is not always what happens. That is why the subcommittee will take a long, hard look at current VA policies and federal institutions intended to protect whistleblowers. We will also hear testimony from a set of experts that work closely with hundreds of people who similarly raise concerns and face retaliation from the department. I look forward to the testimony of today's witnesses, and with that, I would like to recognize Ranking Member Bergman for 5 minutes for any opening comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. As an aviator, I know firsthand how vital it is that all team members at every level of an organization feel empowered to bring problems forward. When I climbed into an aircraft, I trusted that everyone, from aircraft maintenance to my most junior ground crew and flight crew members to my co-pilot, that they would alert me to any concerns they had. All of our safety, my safety and the safety of the crew and the cargo, depended on a deep level of trust and communication. Similarly, as a leader of Marines, I needed all my units to be empowered to raise concerns because of the health and safety of troops, and the mission demanded it. The Department of Veterans Affairs is no different. As we saw with the Phoenix wait time scandal in 2014, and Dr. Mitchell, who is here with us today, was an important voice in that disclosure, VA employees had the courage to sound the alarm and potentially save lives. Leadership must create an environment where such alarms are taken seriously, investigated thoroughly, and prompt remedial action is taken when necessary. Today, the subcommittee will receive testimony from whistleblowers and organizations that represent them in an effort to better understand the current state of whistleblowing protections and accountability in the VA. In addition to Congress, whistleblowers have three main venues to raise concerns: the Office of Special Counsel, the Office of Inspector General, and the Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection, or OAWP. Employees can blow the whistle in one or all three of these venues. I would like to hear from the whistleblowers about their experience with each of these offices. With three separate organizations potentially performing the same investigation, I am interested in the witnesses' perspectives on the differences and relevant strengths and weaknesses of each office and any suggestions that they may have for improvement. From the organizational witnesses, I would like to hear their opinion concerning the elements of a sound whistleblower program. I'm interested in understanding which federal agencies they believe have a good whistleblower program and what constructive and concrete actions VA could take to improve its program. In the written testimony, the witnesses described several incidents of retaliation and reprisal. There was no question that the state of whistleblower protections in the VA reached a low point several years ago. This important issue, overlooked for so long, finally attracted widespread attention. During the 115th Congress, we passed and President Trump signed into law several enhancements to the VA's whistleblowing program, chiefly the VA Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act of 2017 and the Dr. Chris Kirkpatrick Whistleblower Protection Act of 2017, which mandated tough penalties for supervisors retaliating against whistleblowers. I need to hear from you how well these reforms are working. I'm under no illusion that everything is perfect and that work remains to be done. It is important that this Congress, that we evaluate whether the last Congress's enhancements have improved the process. Originally, the government witnesses who could provide that information were scheduled to testify in July, but their testimony has now been delayed until September. This is unfortunate because the committee would greatly benefit from hearing from VA and the other government witnesses about the current state of whistleblowing program. This hearing was presented to me as the first hearing to help members understand the whistleblowing process and show the depth and complexity of the process. In other words, a non-political educational hearing. However, on Saturday, USA Today published a story on today's hearing identifying the witnesses without comment from the other governmental organizations. Then yesterday evening, the chairman's staff advised my staff that one of today's witnesses received a notice of her proposed removal and is concerned that this is reprisal. Mr. Chairman, as you will learn this Congress, the VA does not work that fast. Mr. Chairman, the committee received a letter, which I have here, from Secretary Wilkie this morning on this hearing. I ask unanimous consent that it be included in the record.
Without objection.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, pursuant to Committee Rule 3 and the House Rule 11, Clause 2, I request the right to call minority witnesses before the close of this hearing. Those witnesses should include VA, the VA Inspector General, the Office of Special Counsel, and the Merit Systems Protection Board. I believe that it is imperative to receive testimony from these witnesses as soon as possible while today's testimony is still fresh in the minds of members, because whistleblowers deserve it. I would like your commitment to hold this hearing either this week or at least the first week we return. Whistleblowers provide an important service to the country. However, the way this hearing has evolved has the potential to create the perception that complaints fall on deaf ears. If whistleblowers do not have confidence in the system, we are putting patient health and safety at risk. With that, I yield.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Bergman, and I want to give you my commitment that we always intended to do a second hearing, and we are eager to work with you, the majority and minority staff together to call witnesses and ensure that this happens as soon as possible, and hold a hearing that also includes the VA. So if you want to take that commitment, we are going to be happy to work with you, shortly after this hearing concludes on setting a time frame for that.
Well, unfortunately, this town has a very short memory, and unless we condense it so we can get that full perspective, because as oversight and investigation, as you very well know, we have to look at it from 360 degrees, and the information has to be fresh and current, and I appreciate that.
Thank you. I will now recognize our first witness for the panel. First, we have Dr. Catherine Mitchell, a physician who's worked with the VA for more than 20 years. The subcommittee thanks you for appearing with us today. Dr. Mitchell, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. By nature, I'm a very private person. I was ethically compelled to become a public whistleblower only because there were no other avenues to keep veterans from dying. My disclosures on access and poor quality care had national VA implications and encouraged a wave of VA employees to speak up about serious VA problems. As a result, I received the 2014 Federal Employee of the Year Award. The VA entered into a settlement agreement with me and gave me a patient care oversight position. I've been described by the VA as a whistleblower success story and as definitive proof that the VA embraces whistleblowers. However, nothing could be further from the truth, and I'm here to set the record straight today. In 2014, I testified at this committee's groundbreaking whistleblower hearing that finally brought VA retaliation into the spotlight. I had hoped my 2014 testimony would help jumpstart positive change so that all employees could report problems without fear of retaliation. Unfortunately, VA administrators today still continue to retaliate. The only change I have seen is that since 2014 is that administrators are now much more skilled at weaponizing investigation boards and manufacturing charges. In my case, I've experienced ongoing retaliation that started shortly after signing a 2014 retaliation settlement agreement. For example, for nearly 5 years, I've been prohibited from performing every major duty listed in the written job description that was given to me as part of the legally binding settlement agreement. For about 2 years, I was banned from initiating contact with all VA medical center staff in my region. From 2014 until 2018, I had no regular assignments. Although I am highly trained as a VA quality scholar, I'm excluded from almost every oversight activity, and I'm not officially allowed to intervene in patient care problems. I have not been silent about this retaliation, but I cannot seem to make it stop. There are no easy avenues to obtain relief from VA retaliation, and VA administrators know it. Since 2015, I've intermittently notified my chain of command to no avail. In 2016, I contacted the Office of Special Counsel, or OSC, to get help with the broken settlement agreement. The OSC agreed to informally work with the VA, but the VA declined to respond or participate. At that time, because of OSC backlog, my only option was to file another whistleblower retaliation complaint and wait my turn in line. It was a wait that would be 15 months long before the OSC had time to review my case. In 2017, I also contacted several congressional offices, but merely was referred to the Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection, or OAWP. I initiated contact with the OAWP twice in 2017 and requested to file a claim. I then waited about 16 months before I got an OAWP response back that merely asked me if I was still interested in filing a claim. At that time, the self-described OAWP procedure for investigation was so alarming to me that I opted not to use its services. In 2017, I also sent the VA a legal, formal notice of breach of settlement agreement. In response, I received and accepted an offer for a short-term assignment with the potential for a longer-term position. However, the VA suddenly canceled the offer without explanation shortly after I gave a public interview about escalating levels of VA retaliation. I subsequently sent a second legal notice to the VA, but the VA just ignored it. I never received a response. In approximately October 2018, the OSC conducted a preliminary investigation and found ample evidence of retaliation against me. I subsequently agreed to mediation with the VA to resolve the issues quickly. Unfortunately, once again, the VA no longer has the expedited mediation process that was available in 2014. As a result, I have remained in mediation for 9 months and counting with absolutely no end in sight. This delay is primarily due to VA responses that are extraordinarily slow, piecemeal, and on one occasion so disturbing that it felt like it should be counted as retaliation in itself. In my opinion, the VA's callous approach to mediation illustrates the degree to which the agency devalues whistleblowers and tries to avoid institutional accountability for the retaliation. I am definitely not the only prominent whistleblower treated this way. Dr. Christian, head of the Greater Los Angeles VA, and Scott Davis of a national VA office are still experiencing extreme ongoing retaliation ever since testifying with me in that fateful 2014 whistleblower hearing. Frankly, if the VA has no qualms about aggressively targeting well-known whistleblowers, it stands to reason that lesser-known whistleblowers will be targeted with even more enthusiasm and absolutely do not stand a chance alone. Ultimately, whistleblowers are not guilty of anything other than reporting serious problems that leadership wants to camouflage. Until leadership culture improves, whistleblowers will serve as a vital, necessary safety net for veterans. Whistleblower retaliation threatens that safety net and imminently jeopardizes the health and safety of every veteran in the system. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mitchell, for your work, for your courage in appearing here today, and for looking out for our veterans. I will now recognize our second witness, Jeff Devine. He is a registered radiologic technologist who has worked at the VA for more than 14 years. Mr. Devine, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm a 14-year employee at the Iowa City VA Medical Center. I've been a radiologic technologist for over 29 years. I became a whistleblower out of concern that the veterans were being placed at risk of not receiving the care they desperately needed and the unnecessary risk to patient care presented by non-medical personnel practicing as physicians. I observed the first improper cancellation of a radiology order in February 2017. A veteran presented for a CT of the chest for a lung cancer screening, but the order had been improperly canceled by the radiology service secretary. I later discovered that the administrative officer and secretaries were risking patient lives by overriding crucial physician orders. I immediately alerted supervisory chain, but no one would listen. Nobody seemed to care. In June of 2017, I persistently reported the problems in radiology. False complaints were made about my job performance. The complaints came at approximately the same time of my first disclosure to Senator Grassley. Management misled Senator Grassley with bogus excuses about one patient's canceled imaging order when they had been actually 12,660 orders canceled. I'd be more than happy to expound on the VA's deception if asked during the question and answers. In July of 2017, my banishment from the hospital began and continues today. Once I was removed from the main facility, others, afraid to speak out, told me of secret lists of veterans who had not received the imaging for their specialty clinic appointments, imaging essential for doctors to accurately diagnose and treat life-threatening conditions. I reported this to the OIG. In August of 2017, I was targeted by a rigged AIB investigation. There was no charge letter. I was only informed that they were addressing issues in radiology. It became clear from the accusatory nature of the questions, I was the target. Senator Ernst's office connected me with the OSC, and I filed disclosure and retaliation complaints. I also filed with the Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection, sent them countless emails attempting to get a progress report about my case. They never bothered to address me. In November 2017, a baseless patient abuse allegation was manufactured, prompting my removal from direct patient care. December of 2017, the Chief of Staff, Stanley Parker, proposed my termination on charges cooked up from the AIB. The clearly fabricated testimony of witnesses and management in the AIB prompted me to seek legal assistance with the process of blowing the whistle. I've experienced another common VA retaliation tactic: malicious complaints to my licensing agencies, twice to the American Registry of Radiologic Technologists and once to the Iowa Department of Public Health. These overt attempts are to blacklist me from both Iowa and national licensing. For every person who wants to speak up, there are thousands that have tried, only to be removed, demoted, or intimidated into silence. The process of seeking a whistleblower assistance is confounding to me. Do I file with OIG, OSC, OAWP? The list goes on. Although I've navigated to this point, not everyone's that fortunate. After 23 months, my current situation is horrendous. The VA has mothballed me into a makeshift position as a records requester. I've not had a performance appraisal in 3 years. I'm forced to forego merit increases and about 1/3 of my salary. But worst of all, the VA has ripped my patients away from me. Whistleblowers are essential to ensure the best quality care our veterans need and deserve. If not for the veterans, I would not be a whistleblower. The veterans I'm trying to protect and help have become an extended family to me. As I've continually stated throughout this process, they are someone's mother, father, sister, brother, husband, wife. Taking care of the patients and ensuring the best possible care for the veterans is why I'm here. Taking care of people is what I do. At this point in time in my life, I haven't much to lose or anything to gain. However, the veterans that I'm here for, stand up for, and am a voice for do have a lot to lose: their lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us and for caring for our veterans. We appreciate it. I will now recognize our third witness, Dr. Minu Agevli. She's a clinical psychologist who has worked at the VA for more than 15 years. Dr. Agevli, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Minu Agevli, and I'm the program coordinator of the opioid program at the VA Maryland Healthcare System in Baltimore. I have a PhD in clinical psychology, and I've been with the VA for almost 20 years, my entire career. I even did my internship, and postdoc there. Back in 2013, as the opioid epidemic was getting going, we found ourselves unable to keep up with the demand for treatment, and we had to start a wait list. Management almost immediately started pressuring me to reduce the size of our official wait list in various ways that I felt were improper, such as removing people from the unofficial wait list by scheduling them fake appointments in an imaginary clinic. I felt these things were wrong, and I protested. I went up through my official chain of command in the facility. I eventually went all the way to the secretary of the VA, actually 2 secretaries. I came to the OIG repeatedly, and I spoke to members of this committee. After I started voicing my concerns about our improper waitlist practices, the agency threatened to remove me as coordinator of the program and transfer me to a different area of the hospital. I went to both the OIG and the OSC. The transfer was rescinded in the end, but not until the last possible minute before it went into place. Over the last 5 years, this pattern of retaliation and threats has continued. It doesn't matter that my performance evaluations have been uniformly outstanding. I have experienced constant harassment, scrutiny, and frivolous investigations. Management has stripped me of authority in ways that have been humiliating. I am exhausted. Last year, I reported concerns about a patient death, and I was threatened with a reprimand. Earlier this year, I had expressed concerns about a serious patient safety concern. And 2 months ago, yesterday, the agency told me that they were summarily suspending my clinical privileges. The stated reason for this was that I had gone to visit a high-risk patient in a community hospital after he had overdosed, been treated in our emergency room, and then discharged. While I was visiting him, the veteran also told me that he had attempted suicide after leaving the hospital. Since my privileges have been suspended for the last 2 months, I've been forbidden to talk to any patients or engage in patient care, and I've been assigned menial administrative tasks in a situation that seemed chosen to be as stressful and publicly humiliating as possible. A couple weeks ago, I informed my supervisors that I was going to testify at this hearing. I sent them a copy of the invitation. Yesterday, I was informed that they were starting the process to remove me under the Whistleblower Protection Act provisions. This feels obviously retaliatory, but worse than that, I feel like I'm being used as a threat against other employees who might think about speaking up, about patient care concerns, and I resent that. I do not want to be used as a pawn. I've gone repeatedly to the OSC for help with retaliation over the last 5 years, but the OSC has continually let me down. The process can take years. My last complaint took almost 3 years to resolve. Also, they've not been able to help me because they've told me that when the VA has threatened me with actions but then not followed through, or even when they have followed through but then reversed course, the OSC does not consider this a personnel action that they can remedy. Even when my privileges were suspended, the OSC told me that this was not considered a personnel action. I don't understand this because I know that under the statute, threats against whistleblowers are not permitted, they're prohibited. And honestly, suspending someone's privileges is worse than taking a disciplinary action because even if somehow my termination is stopped, I will still have to put down that my privileges were suspended every time I renew my license or if I ever apply for a job for the rest of my career. So it's kind of like having an arrest record I can't ever expunge. Finally, I just want to say that the way the VA is allowed to retaliate against whistleblowers, it has a terrible effect on veterans. I've taken care of some of my patients for almost 20 years. I see some of them every day when they come into the clinic. They are like my family. It has broken my heart to not see them during this past 2 months. Sometimes I'm one of the most stable people in their lives. And so when I abruptly disappear, it affects them. Recovery from addiction is so difficult already. And it's hard to do. It's easy to give up on yourself if you don't think you're worth fighting for. Many of our patients don't have people in their lives who advocate for them, and sometimes that's the role we play. We advocate for our patients, and we tell them that they're worth it and they matter. And if our colleagues see people retaliated against for trying to stand up for our veterans, that will have a chilling effect and our veterans will suffer. And I am asking this committee to please expand protections for people like us, because we need to shift the culture of the VA from one that tells us to be quiet and keep our heads down when we see something that's wrong to a place that values speaking up for what's right. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your strength in appearing here and for your comments today. Thank you to each of our witnesses for being a part of this hearing. We'll now begin the question portion of the hearing for the first panel, and I'll begin by recognizing myself for questioning for 5 minutes. And I want to voice my appreciation again for all of you for appearing here today. I think the testimony we just heard makes it clear that stepping forward as a whistleblower is difficult, it's frustrating, it's time-consuming, and becoming a whistleblower has major personal consequences. Dr. Gevely, if I could start with you. As you mentioned, you were notified yesterday that the VA intends to terminate your employment. And I'm wondering if you could describe a little bit more to the committee what the notice will mean for you, even if you were able to gain protection as a whistleblower?
Do you mean if I am actually terminated or?
Well, just the fact that a notice has been served to you, you know, what does that mean for you going forward as you grapple with this and you know, seek to be protected?
Well, it was devastating to receive because, like I said, I've never worked anywhere else than the VA. So I feel like that's my whole world. I had filed with OSC already. So I'm hoping that they can offer me some protection, but it's very stressful.
Well, I can only imagine what you're going through, and I think it's a little suspicious that the VA chose to communicate its intent to terminate Dr. Gevley the day before this hearing. Just a couple days after an article was published, and a few weeks after you, you know, gave your intent to your supervisor to appear here and to speak truth about some of the things that you're seeing at the VA. And I think we need to give you our commitment that we're going to do everything we can to protect folks who are in your position. We can't allow individuals to be intimidated who are coming forward with important information. Dr. Mitchell, I'm wondering if I could ask you a question. Your testimony describes a story that would seem, in one sense, successful because you blew the whistle in 2014 about wait times and people heard your story. Congress took action, hearings were held, and eventually it led to new laws. And for you personally, after going through the long and arduous whistleblower process, you were reinstated. Yet you said today that you still face retaliation. And as I understand it, the Office of Special Counsel, the independent federal agency that investigates whistleblower retaliation, has found this to be the case. Dr. Mitchell, do I have it correct that you are once again under retaliation, and could you comment on what this means for your ability to do your job at the VA?
The retaliation never stopped. The only difference is that the way the retaliation is occurring has changed. Before, it was making me work unlimited hours without compensation or dropping my performance evaluations. Now it is basically excluding me from any opportunity I have to oversee patient care and address the problems. My title is Specialty Care Medicine Consultant. I'm supposed to be allowed by my job description to oversee patient care, to be involved in risk management and utilization review. I have been excluded from all those activities. I cannot verify that the VA has improved things when issues come up. I can tell you that in the last 5 years, I've seen tremendous strides in patient care and access across the VA in general. I'm proud to send my family members to the VA. I believe the VA provides millions of high-quality episodes of care every year in a manner that in many ways is superior to private sector. But I'm not allowed to help improve that care at all. It is incredibly frustrating and devastating as a physician. Like so many of us, we are rather high-performing, and our work, we are our work. And not to be able to do that work is psychologically incredibly difficult.
Well, thank you. And Mr. Detbarm, we just have a few seconds left, but you described a very difficult personal process that you've gone through as a result of blowing the whistle. And I'm wondering if you could comment on why you continue as a whistleblower and why you haven't given up.
The patients, the veterans, that's what we're here for. As I stated, we take care of people, and these are family. We know their names, their histories, their loved ones. You're taking care of a family. It's not just a person. They're a family.
Thank you very much for your response. I'd now like to recognize General Bergman, the ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Mitchell, in your testimony, you recommend that OAWP speed up the intake and triage process and improve transparency. Can Can you tell me what your expectations are as it relates to the timeliness and transparency of the OAWP? Can you give me some examples?
Yes, you're referring to my written testimony, section 4, where and 5. There are a couple things. First of all, when I contacted the OAWP, I asked if the documents I was going to provide to the OAWP would be shared with my supervisors. The first time the lady spoke with me offline on the telephone to let me know that, yeah, they probably could. The second time I actually got email confirmation that if I submitted documents, it would go to my in the process of investigation, it could go to my supervisors. That would be the very first thing I would stop with the OAWP. They need, if there's going to be an investigation, whether they do it themselves or they refer it to the VISN or the facility to do it, the employee needs to know that their documents will be held confidential.
Okay.
That's very important. There are some other things. I don't know what is a reasonable timeliness period, but I do know 16 months is not. Others have told me it's been a year. If you're talking about a major action where an employee is suffering a risk of termination or demotion or suspension, those actions can occur within a week or two. The OAWP should have processes in place to be able to mobilize quickly to go in and examine whether or not those personnel actions are appropriate in the context.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Devine, in your written testimony, you state that, quote, the process of seeking assistance as a whistleblower was truly confounding, end quote, and that you did not know how any employee would know who to contact. It is my understanding that the No Fear Act of 2002 mandates that federal agencies provide employees annual notice of certain federal laws, including the whistleblower laws, and training on such laws no less frequently than every 2 years. Have you taken that training, and are you saying that the training is inadequate? How could VA improve on that training to make it easier for all employees to understand and not be confounded?
Yes, I've taken the training. Everyone takes it. The problem is that we don't have the support from our agencies when we do finally figure out who to report to, and then we're turned over to the agency for their own investigation. So the training looks great on paper. Everybody did it. But when you try to actually go about the process, going online to the OIG site or OSC site, wherever, if you're not a computer savvy person, it's mind-boggling.
Okay. So basically, it's online training.
Correct.
Okay.
Could I add to that?
Go ahead.
I feel like I could teach the no fear training at this point. And the problem is that it's not true. So in the no fear training.
First of all, what's
Yeah.
not true?
Well, so they state that, bullying is prohibited and harassment is prohibited. But I've filed with the OSC now 3 times, and they're very lengthy applications. You have to describe the entire history of your retaliation. So, I've gone back 5 years. But then what I've been told is bullying is not covered as a prohibited personnel practice that the OSC can help me with. So it feels frustrating because I take that training every time and I think, I wish I could get help with this. My life would be much better if I could get help with this.
Okay. Well, thank you. I see that my time is running short, so I'll just yield back the 30 seconds, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Cisneros for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today and having the courage to come forward. I just wondering if any of you could answer this, or all of you could answer this, but what is the messaging that the VA gives you as far as coming forward to whistleblowing, to reporting incidents, to reporting something that you see that's wrong, and contrast that with the reality for me?
The VA administration does very good public relations as far as stating that they will not tolerate retaliation. They are actually trying to become what's called a high reliability organization. It's a new initiative where it's a culture of safety. Everyone is supposed to be encouraged to speak up. Although I have had supervisors who are excellent supervisors, very ethical. In general, when you bring up a problem to the VA, you risk your professional reputation, your credibility, and if they go after you as viciously as they have been, you risk your ability to support yourself and your livelihood, because as Mr. Devine said, they will maliciously manufacture things and report you to your license. I know of at least, or licensing agency, I know of at least 5 physicians who've spoken up, who were fired or had to leave and could not get a job for at least a year, sometimes 2 years, and in one case 5 years. This is a radiologist, a radiation oncologist, an internal medicine physician, highly skilled surgeon. This retaliation, I know some people think that it's office politics. It's not. This is a vicious, relentless assault on everything that's important to you. It drives people to the edge. Chris Kirkpatrick was driven to the edge. He was the psychologist out of Toma who committed suicide. Frankly, this is my 10th year of retaliation. It started 5 years before the Access scandal, and it's now. I am a well-rounded woman. I'm intelligent. I have a great support system. I would have successfully committed suicide a while ago because the retaliation is so severe. I don't say that to shock you, but to open your eyes that this retaliation is vicious. This is at a level that you can't imagine, and it's destructive to everyone and endangers veterans, because anyone with a reasonable mind would not speak up in this culture. People tell me things so I can report it because they are too afraid of what will happen to them.
And any of you can answer the second question as well, but when you've come forward to report the incidents or the wrongdoing that you saw, did anybody come and visit you to discourage you to retract your statement and who was this? Is it junior personnel, junior supervisors, or is it coming from higher ups within the VA facilities or even higher up than that?
I think in my case, people have expressed concern for me that something will happen to me if I say something.
Were those friends, or were they like supervisors that came?
Both.
Okay.
I mean, I was advised at one point that I would probably need to change jobs or leave. And look at what's happening. I am now sitting in a congressional hearing, and I've been proposed for removal. So I guess that was good advice. I mean, I totally agree with Dr. Mitchell. I think there's a culture of like, we do not air our dirty laundry. And it's very destructive, because it means that instead of being able to, look at things that didn't go as well as they might and learn from mistakes and problem solve, it's just a stonewalling.
Mr. Devine, did anybody encourage you to kind of retract your statement or anything that you saw?
No one encouraged me to retract my statement, but I think I came across strong enough at the beginning that I wasn't going to back down from this. This is an important issue, and veterans' health care is at stake. They tote the I care, no fear. We have to take these online courses every year, and it is exactly the opposite of what these courses teach us that we are confronted with from management in the VA.
All right, with that, thank you very much for your testimony here today and for coming forward. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Radewagen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel for being here today. My question is for all 3 of you. What are some specific actions that Congress could take right now to improve protections for whistleblowers? If I could get maybe 1 or 2 answers from each of you, please, briefly.
There are 2 things. The Merit Systems Protection Board is backlogged 2,000 cases in 4 years because there's no 3-person quorum. If there could be a bipartisan effort to make sure that whatever's done is taken, or whatever needs to be done is taken, to make sure there's a 3-person quorum. I don't care what the political party is. I just need those people. There's 2,000 people waiting with potentially improper personnel actions. The other thing is the OSC was grossly understaffed for many years. Their budget is 1% less. Their backlog 2,600 cases. They found a way to hire 11 people by redoing their lease. But I would go to them and say, what kind of monies do you need? They're getting historic levels of employees coming to them, and a huge portion are from the VA. They do excellent work when they have enough staffing, but when they don't have enough staffing, they cannot do the work they intend to do.
Yeah, I would add a similar thing. I think cases need to be processed quicker, because if you wait years, you're in a limbo. The way adverse actions and personnel actions are defined seems very, very narrow to me. You know, proposing actions and then pulling them back at the last minute over and over again is exhausting. That's threatening. I think in a lot of other workplaces that would constitute harassment and intimidation. And then in my case, you know, if I didn't have a pending case before the OSC, I would have 7 days to deal with this huge evidence file and mount some sort of defense. And if I didn't have a lawyer to help me, I don't know what I'd do. So the way the removal process goes now under the law is very difficult for most people to handle. I think we need a little bit more protection. I mean, if you're about to be removed, it seems like you need a little bit more in place to help you. I agree when people are, you know, bad actors and they've done something wrong, obviously they need to be able to be removed. But if you're facing reprisal, that's a very thin margin.
Mr. Devine?
This sounds very simple, but listen to the whistleblower, and instead of acting, there was so much money and time wasted in the disagreement of what I was, or the rebuttal to my disclosures. The problem could have been fixed 2 years ago when it was brought up. But instead of listening and trying to fix it, all we got was excuses of why it was happening. I believe that when the OAWP was put into process, there were 1,800 people terminated within the first year. Only 15 were supervisors, management positions. The fact that 1,700 people that were environmental services, nurses' aid, food service workers, I don't think that's where our problem is.
Can I add to that? I feel like when I read these OIG reports, I'm not an expert and I don't pretend to know about other facilities, but I feel like often they'll identify a major problem, like, you know, there's improper management of a wait list, and what they'll focus on is the frontline staff. Like, all of these frontline staff are scheduling improperly, but they'll fail to look at whether this is being directed in some way. And even if it isn't one person saying, you do this, is there a culture at that facility that is influencing people to do these things? And I think over and over again, we're not looking at that as a system. We're just picking off the people at the very bottom, like the low-hanging fruit, and so it keeps happening.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I now recognize Ms. Rice for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry, I thought there was someone else before me. First, I'd like to thank all three of you for testifying here today about your experience as whistleblowers. Your dedication to serving our veterans is not only exemplified by the work that you have done, but through your decision to continue working at the VA despite the challenges and the intimidation tactics that you have faced. I'm sure I speak for everyone on this committee when I express my deep concern about the instances of ongoing retaliation that you have shared with us today. This is completely unacceptable. I mean, we cannot allow individuals who are brave enough to come forward about threats to veterans' health and safety and who are perfectly more than good at their jobs to be pushed out of their positions while those responsible for actual wrongdoing are not held accountable. The fact that all three of you reported misconduct at the VA regarding wait times and backlogs, some of which occurred as far back as 2014, and only a couple of weeks ago as well, there was another whistleblower report about the same exact issues and subsequent retaliation for reporting it, points to systemic cultural problems within the VA management that this committee simply cannot ignore. I mean, it's not as if every whistleblower is talking about a new problem. We're talking about the same things happening. Clearly, they're not being fixed. Mr. Devine, can you just talk a little bit more, because this gets to the heart of whenever we have had management before us in hearings. I have always focused on how far up the chain goes. Where is the accountability? If someone becomes a whistleblower, and this is to the point that you were making, Mr. Devine, they don't, out of 1,800 people who were fired, none of them were executives, or very few, at the top who were actually responsible for addressing the issues that all of you have exposed. So if you can just talk a little bit more about your perception of how their willingness to hold people at lower levels accountable for problems that are far more systemic than just, a one-off, so to speak.
The people that are being held accountable, the lower level echelon, if you want to call us that, we were instructed to do this by management. This came down, we were constantly told a directive, the Duchamp Directive, gave us authority to cancel these orders. What Duchamp Directive? Show me that directive. If you're going to tell me to cancel a patient's order, you better have it in writing of what I'm supposed to do. The directive that gave them the authority to cancel orders with all of the stipulations wasn't signed until September of 2017. They started canceling. The first patient showed up February 22nd, 2017, months before the directive was ever even signed. And the lists that were given out to subordinates by management, it came from the chief of staff to my administrative officer, who then doled out the lists of orders to be canceled. So if your boss tells you to do something, you would hope that it wasn't illegal. And you sure don't expect to get in trouble when you question, what are we doing? You can't do this. And then you end up like the three of us. And something that you said, Ms. Rice, that I thought was very inspiring. We choose to stay at our positions. And we choose that because we care. We truly care about the veterans and our patients and their families.
Well, that's very obvious. That is very obvious. So one of the things that I like about this committee is that it's not a political committee. All we care about is making sure that our veterans, our brave men and women, are served. And these complaints, this horrifying treatment of whistleblowers, Obama was president when you, Dr. Mitchell, when you had your in 2014, and some has been under the Trump administration. I think this agency suffers from, especially over the past 2.5 years, of being completely rudderless. There's no one at the top. There's no accountability. But that's not to say that the problems with whistleblowers only have existed over the past 2.5 years. Even when there was a dedicated Senate-confirmed secretary of the VA, the problems with whistleblowers existed too. So I'm just trying to figure out what is at the core of this problem. Is it because there's no leadership at the top? Is it because the culture is just so, this corrupt, because that's what it is, this corrupt culture is just so embedded in the agency? And this is for all of you. If we'll start with you, Dr. Mitchell.
Yes, the agency is 89 years old. I've been working in it for 30 years, either as a student or a nurse or a physician. And the culture of leadership has been malignant even back in 1989 when I started. This has nothing...
Why? Why do you...
I don't know what started originally, but what happens is that leadership people promote people that are like them, so bad promoted like. And that's very common. So you have a culture of people that are all like-minded. I will tell you, I don't want to paint all leadership with a broad brush, because I've known some very ethical, very good people, supervisors, administrators, who are wonderful. The problem is there are only two types of administrators or leaders in the VA: those that wield power unethically and retaliate, and those that wield power ethically but don't have the power to stop the retaliation. I've had my supervisors, I had two of them, who were very sympathetic that I wasn't allowed to do anything in my job description, but they said they couldn't overcome politics. I don't blame them, because they too would have been targeted and they would have been fired. And again, this has nothing to do with who's in office. Things got worse 2 years ago because the media's attention turned off whistleblowers and turned on to other politics and other things. It has nothing to do who's in the president's office or who controls Congress. This is a malignant leadership culture that will outlast us all unless someone has the courage to break rank and in leadership and finally change it.
Unfortunately, we're out of time
I
here.
apologize, Mr.
That's quite all right. I appreciate your response, and I want to recognize Mr. Roy for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Couldn't agree more than my colleague, Ms. Rice, about the extent to which this is clearly a bipartisan problem. I just want to thank you guys for standing up, having the courage to stand up, and just know that, at least I'm going to speak for myself, and I think my colleagues, that we have your back. This is not the way things should operate, and really want to thank you for doing what you're doing. It's important, and it means a lot. It means a lot to the veterans who are not receiving the service they should. It means a lot to the country that you would have the courage to do this, so thank you. That's a couple quick questions. Dr. Mitchell, you describe administrative investigative boards and professional standards boards as being weaponized. What sort of oversight exists? If you could give any help on the sort of oversight exists for these boards?
There is no oversight. Officially, Human Resources is supposed to be in charge of it. What happens is that the rules are complex, but there are some basic things about giving a charge letter, basically telling a person they're being investigated, rules of evidence, procedure, making sure that it's a neutral people on the panel. What they do by weaponizing, they used to just do one or two things. Now they do all of them. They make sure that the people on the panel are either cronies of the person who's doing the retaliation or are too afraid to stand up to that person to go against what the retaliator says. When they give a packet of evidence, it used to be a few sheets of paper and there was missing pieces. Now what they do, especially for physicians, is they'll go back through every case the physician has ever done, pull up 30 or 40 cases, give pieces of information, even though the physician didn't do anything wrong, put it in a packet, jumble them up, and then give the person 7 days to respond. Another thing is that they don't give them a list of their rights. What they need to do is develop a standard operating procedure and a checklist and make sure that, and get your best and brightest HR people, make sure you have the rules, there's a step-by-step procedure, so it's AIBs and standard professions boards are done the same way at each facility. There's a checklist that's electronically signed off, and then if anyone deviates from that checklist, they are held immediately accountable and responsible. I can tell you right now that alone would stop a huge amount of these frivolous AIB boards The other thing is the fact-finding investigations. Fact-finding investigations are basically fishing expeditions. They're not a full AIB, but what they do is they go to your colleagues or to people in your area and say, you know, Dr. So-and-so is doing this, or nurse so-and-so is doing this. Can you tell me about that? And they kind of feel out about which employees they can get to give reports of contacts that are false. Another thing they do is if you're, there's a chief of staff out of Dublin, VA, Carlene Baptiste Downey, in her AIB, none of the affidavits were signed, and more importantly, a lot of them were from employees that she had legitimately given disciplinary action because they were substandard performers. Administration went to those people and got them to say that she was creating a hostile work environment. The credibility was questionable to begin with. The techniques of weaponizing these AIBs are very good, very effective, and once it's done, it takes the employee literally years to reverse it, and that has to stop. That tool has to be taken away.
Well, I don't even know where to begin. I mean, I'd like to dive into that and, you know, sit here for, but I've got 5 minutes, but I want to know more about that. Dr. Gevely, again, thank you. I know it's pretty tough week for you, but again, we're here and we're listening. Just what parts of the whistleblower protection law are not being followed in your observation?
Is that on? Oh, sorry. I mean, I think more than anything, like I said, I don't feel like the things that have made my life miserable in the last 5 years have been acknowledged when I went for help. You know, I feel like the ways I've been harassed and intimidated when I went to try to get help from the OSC, I've been told over and over again that those were not things that they could intervene in. And it's been confusing because, like we talked about a couple minutes ago, when I take the trainings on things like no fear, I would understand that those are things that are prohibited. So I've ended up feeling kind of like anything could be done to me. I mean, in a way, I'm almost relieved. I was relieved to get that letter because it felt like the other shoe dropping.
Mr. Chairman, if I might ask one more question. I know I'm over my 5 minutes. Thank you for that. And again, I'd like to go and explore that further. The fact that you're describing 5 years public service is miserable, and for you personally is really troubling.
Well, but I should say I love my job.
Yep.
And, you know, it's scary to just feel like at any moment I could come into work and something else is going to happen.
Mr. Detbarn, quickly, you said for every person who gets to this point of being a whistleblower, there are 1,000 that have spoken up early to be removed. That is a staggering number. Where do you get that number? Is that kind of hyperbolic, or is there any kind of assessment to that number?
No, there's no assessment. It's just my experience with the people that I've had to deal with. I've had many, many coworkers feeding me information since this whole cancellation of orders fiasco began. So once you get to this point, there are a lot of people that are willing to help and fight for the veterans. And that's where I get that number, is the number of people that have reached out to me to try to get their voice heard.
Well, God bless you all. Thank you for what you're doing.
Well, thank you. And before we close out this panel, I just wanted to recognize Ranking Member Bergman for a brief statement.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and truly thank you to all of you. As I listened to all of the questions and all of your responses, this is not a simple matter. It is a very complex one that has occurred and built over time and over decades. This did not just occur in the last couple of years, what I heard you saying. This has been building for a while and through previous administrations, whatever that might mean. So I just wanted to acknowledge your selflessness in coming here, and I thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you. And once again, thank you to our first panel for joining us here today. We really appreciate your time, your thoughts, and your strength. and all the work you do for our veterans. So you are now excused. And I'd like to call up our second panel. Welcome today. Good morning. I'd like to recognize our first witness for the second panel. First up, we have Ms. Rebecca Jones. She's Policy Counsel at the Project on Government Oversight. And Ms. Jones, I'd like to recognize you for 5 minutes.
Chairman Pappas, Ranking Member Bergman, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the vital role of whistleblowers at the Department of Veterans Affairs. I'm Rebecca Jones, a policy counsel at the Project on Government Oversight. Since 1981, POGO has worked to strengthen the effectiveness and accountability of the federal government through independent investigation, analysis, and policy reform. VA whistleblowers put their careers on the line every time they speak truth to power to ensure the best possible care for those who put their lives on the line defending our country. In that way, VA whistleblowers are heroes serving heroes. Their disclosures save patients' lives by identifying barriers to timely and effective medical care due to negligence or intentional misconduct. In the process, whistleblowers expose officials who have perpetuated a culture of abuse for decades and free up misused taxpayer dollars that can instead go toward providing resources and care. And yet, even though whistleblowers are legally protected, they often face retaliation. The Office of Special Counsel reports that 30% of their intake comes from VA employees alone. This is partly because the VA is a massive agency, but it's also because of the overwhelming culture of intimidation and retaliation that has persisted for decades, forcing whistleblowers to seek relief when they're retaliated against. In 2014, alarmed by the Phoenix VA waitlist scandal, POGO and the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America invited VA whistleblowers to make secure disclosures to us online so that we could better understand the prevalence of retaliation at the VA. In just a month, we received disclosures from an unprecedented 800 VA employees, contractors, and veterans who had lost faith in the agency. The theme was clear. Whistleblowers were terrified of speaking out for fear of losing their livelihood. Shortly thereafter, POGO was wrongfully subpoenaed for those disclosures by the VA Inspector General. Although we refused to comply and that subpoena was later dropped after members of Congress stepped in, we nevertheless learned for ourselves that the VA's retaliatory culture permeates the very top levels of the institution. The Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection was created in part to address that culture by holding senior VA officials accountable. The office is a central point of contact for all matters related to whistleblowing, including disclosures and complaints of retaliation. It acts as both an ombudsman and an investigator, depending on the issue at hand. While the impetus behind the office is sensible, POGO expressed initial concerns that creating such an office within the agency itself would cause more harm than good. We worried that the internal office would become a clearinghouse used to identify and retaliate against whistleblowers, and that it wouldn't be effective at holding senior officials accountable because of its lack of independence. Unfortunately, the problems we most feared seem to have become a reality. Last year, both the GAO and the OAWP itself released reports that demonstrate an agency unprepared and unwilling to handle whistleblower investigations in good faith. For example, OAWP noted that the VA's Office of General Counsel is conducting legal reviews of proposed disciplinary actions against senior VA officials. This is not only a glaring conflict of interest, it's contrary to the VA Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act, OAWP's authorizing statute. Second, GAO found that employees accused of misconduct are participating in the investigations into their own behavior, including managers investigating themselves for misconduct. To make matters worse, the decision of whether to implement proposed disciplinary action isn't being appropriately elevated to a more senior office. As a result, an individual can act as both the proposing and deciding official in certain cases. And finally, senior officials are not being held accountable for their actions, making up only 0.1% of disciplinary action taken in the office's first year, maintaining the levels since 2014. VA whistleblowers, many of whom are veterans themselves, blow the whistle because they're honor-bound to speak up when they witness violations of the country's trust or individual suffering caused by negligence or corruption. Unfortunately, VA whistleblowers are 10 times more likely than their peers to face retaliation, according to the GAO. Strengthening opportunities for whistleblower disclosures benefits us all, but it's vital that we be willing to quickly change laws that carry unintended consequences for those they were meant to protect. We ask that you consider amending the structure and work of OAWP to increase its independence so it can better serve whistleblowers and veterans. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. I will now recognize our second witness, Mr. Tom Devine, Legal Director of the Government Accountability Project. Mr. Devine, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. This hearing is timely and necessary because the DVA remains a free speech death valley for government whistleblowers. The agency produces from 30 to 40% of whistleblower complaints nationally in the executive branch, the same as the gap stock it has been for the last few years. This is extraordinary for one agency in the nearly 2 million person executive branch workforce. And if there were any hope that it has learned its lessons, the agency dashed them this month in immediate policy to all employees that impose blanket prior restraint for all communications. This not only violates the Constitution, but 3 provisions of federal law, including 2 in the unanimously passed Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act. Hopefully, this hearing will lead to the DVA respecting the rule of law, at least in terms of official policy. Today's whistleblower testimony is not about an aberration. It's about a way of life. I will share the nightmares of others who risk their professional lives to save the lives of America's veterans. Consider Mr. James Hunt. The secret waiting list scandal horrified the nation and sparked a serious corrective action effort that was leading to significant progress. But over the last 2 years, the agency has gutted it by replacing virtually the entire team of 175 seasoned professional career employees with the green crew of a buddy system contractor. The civil service team initially had received agency commendations, but they were all replaced after a reorganization illegally planned and controlled by the buddy contractor. It reversed internal agency recommendations, violated basic contracting and specialty spending laws, and since the purge, on-site inspections have been replaced by an honor system in the VA's hospitals. Mr. Hunt, the team's associate director, persistently blew the whistle on this sellout. The agency then opened a retaliatory investigations and fired him on pretextual grounds, amazingly for him seeking personal gain on government time, although he had checked and received prior approval for the same actions that non-whistleblowers engaged in and received promotions. Or consider K. Rod Rodriguez, one of the key pioneers who broke the secret waiting list scandals. He disclosed that the agency incorrectly scheduled 400 patients in Phoenix with another 8,000 waiting appointments. He disclosed to Congress a list of 38,000 veterans nationally waiting over 280 days, and he also disclosed the tragic medical consequences, including patient deaths. In response, agency managers moved him to a small, windowless office without air conditioning in Arizona, placed him under surveillance, eliminated his supervisory authority, actively recruiting mobbing allegations against him, lowered his performance appraisal, referred to him as a rat and a media whore, subjected him to an AIB proceeding, failed to respond to death threats against him, and placed him under criminal investigation. Or there's Daniel Martin, the Chief of Engineering Services at Indiana VA facilities, where he also supervised over 100 employees. He disclosed contractual bribery, including for the water purification system essential for the sterilization of medical equipment and safe drinking water for patients. He later learned and disclosed evidence that the Indiana abuses reflected corruption occurring nationally. In response, the agency stripped Mr. Martin of his duties, assigned him to an isolated office, unheated in winter and not air-conditioned in summer, had him perform menial chores under the supervision of a junior staffer, exposed him to asbestos, which was already having destructive medical impact, placed him under 3 retaliatory investigations, primarily for an altercation that his so-called victims denied was more than a conversation. The third probe was conducted by an AIB that denied him access to or even the identities of his accusers. The agency initially refused an OAWP-mediated solution to move him to Seattle, Washington, where management said they would welcome him. Despite canceling his duties, Indiana officials said they could not spare Mr. Martin. It appears he'll finally be allowed to work in Seattle, but over the last 3 years, his life has been a professional nightmare. Why didn't OAWP stop these abuses? Its authority to grant temporary relief initially had an outstanding impact, but despite genuine commitment from some leaders, it has become a threatening source of frustration for whistleblowers as a rule, and an effective remedial agency is the exception. The causes? Lack of structural independence, cultural bias from investigators whose careers have been based on retaliatory investigations, lack of enforcement teeth for permanent relief, effectively, inexplicably canceling its effective whistleblower mentoring program, which diffused conflict and shrank litigation by finding whistleblowers a fresh start, and operating on an ad hoc basis without accountability to regulations. This maximizes confusion and enables arbitrary action. To illustrate, the Senior Executive Association has detailed how OAWP conducted several lengthy, draining investigations of a manager that led to a 5-day suspension, only made possible by removing exculpatory evidence from the file. This is the same outfit that doesn't have time to return whistleblowers' calls. Mr. Chairman, we've got 19 recommendations from the bipartisan trans-ideological Make It Safe Coalition, whose mission is supporting whistleblowers. I hope that we can work with your committee on these, because both this committee and the whistleblower community are committed to making the Whistleblower Protection Act rights a reality at DVA. However, our work is far from finished.
Thank you, Mr. Devine. I'd now like to recognize Ms. Jacqueline Garrick, founder of Whistleblowers of America, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I am truly grateful to be here today because it could not have happened without the support from this committee over my fraud, waste, and abuse disclosures with defense suicide funds and VA contracts. Since then, I've experienced several forms of retaliation, including threats to stop speaking out. It was a frightening and lonely time until I compared notes with other employees. When we realized the potential conflicts and favoritism in contracts, we jointly filed with the DoD and VA OIG on Veterans Day 2016 because the lives of my fellow veterans matter. But other than VA case numbers, nothing, until the OIG came to my home a day after this committee got involved. I gave them documents, emails, and witnesses. I believed investigations are still ongoing. As VA underperforms in high-risk areas, veterans are dying by suicide, denied benefits. Benefits take years to adjudicate. Staffing shortages continue, while money is misspent, ill-managed, or stolen. Reporting is asking to have your career killed and your life threatened. That's unfair. Whistleblowers of America, founded in 2017, has heard from almost 200 VA employees who suffer retaliation, harassment, or discrimination, similar to the 33% of the VA workload at OSC. OAWP has not acted in the way we thought to assist, support, and guide whistleblowers through a protected process and provide a decision algorithm for reporting. Instead, VA employees are ignored, attacked, or regulated to obscurity when they try to engage in process improvements, seek ethical decisions, protect funding, solve patient care challenges. A closer look shows that whistleblowers experience violence, gaslighting, mobbing, shunning, marginalizing, devaluing, double-binding, blackballing, and accusing. These toxic tactics are features of workplace traumatic stress and can lead to PTSD, depression, and suicide. Employees go to OAWP hoping for protection. Instead, it causes more harm because of deficiencies in timeliness, unfair processes, and improper staffing. OAWP has not published a policy. It asks the same chain to investigate the wrongdoing it has been accused of. Investigations are weapons for gathering information for later legal action. AIBs are often conducted by untrained coworkers. At times, the investigator and the proposing official is the same, or the deciding official was named in the complaint. Doctors are reported to the National Practitioner Data Bank even when no charges have been substantiated, have no recourse. Practitioners leave the VA out of fear. Vet center staff were reminded that President Trump curtailed their due process rights and can be fired at any time. Instead, OAWP should be focused on advocacy and a duty to assist by protecting veteran employees over denials, privacy invasions, restrictions from treatment, and disability compensation targeting. No settlement should contain a non-disclosure agreement. Transactions involving taxpayer money, government resources, and the welfare of veterans should remain in the public domain. It should require union reps be consulted, since not every employee even knows they are covered by a bargaining agreement. It should clarify its website data. How are whistleblowers being assisted? How many adverse actions involve veterans? The Kirkpatrick Act mandated agencies report employee suicides. However, Mr. Bergman, you asked about this. OSC says none were made. If suicide prevention is the #1 VA priority, then shouldn't it care about its own workforce? There are 3 main options for OAWP improvement. Publish a policy and transparent data, utilize independent, unbiased staff, and sanction retaliators, or abolish it and transfer the resources to OSC, or allow VA employees to take their cases to civilian courts. OIG. There are no mandates for OIG findings. Guilty managers are not held accountable. Examples. OIG found that $11.7 million of VBA money inappropriately went to Caliber, but no action was taken to reclaim any of those funds or hold managers accountable for wasteful spending. Or what happened to the $6 million that went unspent for suicide prevention? Senior executives with pecuniary responsibility must pass background checks and hold security clearances. OIG should oversee spending accountability, as with the $25 billion Vector IDIQ with 68 companies performing management initiatives. How is that going to be monitored? Congress should expand penalty payments to the judgment fund. Whistleblowers are out of pocket while wrongdoers are defended by the government at taxpayer expense. This is not common sense. Legal aid authority could be expanded to support VA employees. There has been a history of animosity between the OIG and its leadership through criticism, intimidation, and outside influence. We are concerned that emails outside of official VA sources would not be accessible during discovery. Whistleblower feedback is informative, but fear of reprisal causes many to remain bystanders and not veteran advocates. They suffer workplace traumatic stress while senior officials travel to Europe, attend NASCAR, and curry favor with contractors. That's unfair. To reduce stigma, Congress should authorize VA to host an annual whistleblower award and highlight right-doing, and should consider a national whistleblower memorial on the grounds of the Capitol that demonstrates the lamplit pathway many have taken in exercising their First Amendment rights. That concludes my statement. I welcome your questions, and I also just want to say hello to my USC social work students who have been assigned to watch this testimony today. So thank you.
And I'm sure they're still tuning in. I appreciate your testimony, Ms. Garrick, and thank you to our panel. And I'd like to now transition to the questioning period of this, and I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. You all referenced the complicated landscape that exists for individuals who are whistleblowers because there are a variety of agencies across our government that are involved in receiving information and investigating federal employee whistleblower disclosures. I'm wondering, given that current landscape, what can be done to more clearly and effectively communicate to VA employees the best ways for them to disclose instances of mismanagement and to protect themselves from retaliation and be able to identify retaliation in the first place? And that's for the entire panel.
So I think that the idea that OAWP was supposed to be set up for that, or that's how many of us perceived it. They were going to be the source that helped somebody walk through this process. As you've heard, you can go to OAWP. I think Ms. Cloud in her testimony, her written statement describes 11 different opportunities to engage internally before even going to OSC, MSPB, EEOC. There's no decision tree algorithm that helps you walk through that. So even though there is no Fear Act training, it is by no means explains any of those processes to you. So again, I think we need a better understanding of what OAWP is supposed to be doing. They need a policy, or we just need to bolster up OSC and let them do their jobs by helping whistleblowers from outside the agency.
Mr. Chairman, I think to kind of summarize the themes in 19 of our coalition recommendations, one would be to close the loopholes in reprisal protection, such as AIB proceedings or referrals to licensing boards that can cause blacklisting. A second is to restore due process in internal proceedings. The idea was to eliminate roadblocks to accountability, but actually it's backfired, and the lack of due process is being used to railroad whistleblowers out of the agency. The third is to provide enforcement teeth and abolish the conflicts of interest for the agency's checks and balances institutions. That's kind of the core causes behind our frustration.
And I would just add, I think to your note of ensuring that employees know about the different channels and how they interact, I think there's massive confusion, and I think that's evident from the first panel today, that employees simply don't understand the different lines between the IG, the OSC, and the Office of Whistleblower Protection. And I would also just add that ensuring that the VA and its IG are both certified under the Office of Special Counsel's certification program. That's a separate program at the OSC that allows, or that trains and ensures that training within each agency is up to par. And my understanding is that they're not currently certified.
Okay, and I was going to follow up about training by OAWP and how important of a tool that can be once that matures, and I'm wondering if you can comment on the need to ensure that is fully implemented.
Sure, absolutely. I believe when the full committee heard from OAWP or the VA last year on the one-year anniversary of when the office was created, my understanding from that was that they hadn't yet implemented all the training requirements in the authorizing statute. That they had trained certain HR professionals, but that the broad training had yet to be implemented. And I would just, again, point out that they're not, the VA nor the IG are not certified under the OSC's program.
Mr. Chairman, there very much needs to be training of OAWP in the Whistleblower Protection Act. There don't seem to be in practice consistently familiar with its provisions. So many of the staff have come from institutions where they spent their entire lives on assignment to conduct what turned out to be retaliatory investigations against whistleblowers. This accumulated a real bias. That doesn't change with a new location and a new job description. They need to get it.
Thank you. Ms. Garrick, I don't know if you want to respond to that. If not, I have another one.
No, I think they covered it.
Okay, thanks. Just real quickly, we've been hearing a lot in other areas of the VA about the need to have a steady hand at the ship, ensure that we have permanent officials in place at senior leadership positions. Right now, 48% of the senior leadership positions within the VA are held by individuals serving in interim or acting roles. In your experience, does this have an impact on the picture around whistleblowers and a culture of retaliation?
I mean, I would just say, you know, a high turnover rate can be troubling for many reasons. And one of them is sort of a lack of institutional buy-in at the top about changing the culture of retaliation, ensuring that the people who are leading the agency are determined to make the change. Where there's a high turnover, I mean, that it becomes less clear if who they're replaced with will really understand the underlying culture of retaliation and whether they'd be, you know, as determined as others to ensure that there's reform.
Mr. Chairman, the lack of permanent appointments certainly has had a destructive impact, but the problems go long before that current phenomenon. I'd say there's three basic causes that we've identified. The first is that this agency has an almost uniquely feudal structure. kind of bureaucratic barons have far too much authority, and the national office has been frustrated when it tried to do the right thing. Second, there's a culture that allows those barons to put their own personal self-interest above the agency's mission of patient medical care or the rule of law. And finally, there's been a conflict of interest in almost all of the agency's institutional mechanisms to hold itself accountable. And those are three strikes against an effective mission.
Thank you.
So if I may, I've listened to this committee and I've attended a couple of hearings over the last few months, and it just strikes me that when you don't have the right leadership, or you have inexperienced leadership, or you have a revolving door of leadership, what you're losing is expertise and a commitment to the right doing part of all of this. And I wish Ms. Rice was here, because she asked a really good question about the why. The why comes down to the money. And if you can't follow the money and you don't know how to manage the money, I mean, that's the trickle down. That's where these contracts, this IDIQ, enormous amount of money, where is it all going to go? How do you follow it? How do you put something on contract? I mean, I've heard us talk about when you obligate money, execute money, budget money. Those are all different things, and they mean different things in the world of government contracting. And I mean, I've spent 16 years, a lot of that in a management position at VA, at DOD, up here with the congressional staff. I understand how the money flows. And if you don't understand the difference between an award, a deliverable, a sole source, a sub and a prime, a purchase order, all of those things are how the money gets manipulated. And trust me when I tell you, there's your reason for whistleblower retaliation. The panel that was up here, they're at the bottom receiving end of when this money trickles down and when it doesn't trickle down. And that's the incentive to cover all this up. That's the incentive to retaliate. Follow that money.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to recognize General Bergman, the ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here. You bring very broad and unique and necessary insights to the process. First couple questions are going to be simple yes or no. So we're going to start with Ms. Jones, walk across, yes or no. Whistleblowers can file separately with the Office of Special Counsel, OAWP, and the IG. So 3 different ways. This has the potential to cause duplicative work and delays work on other disclosures. For each of these organizations, do you agree or not that with multiple offices potentially investigating the same event, this may not be very efficient or effective?
Yes.
Yes, I do, sir.
I agree.
Okay. Second question. Again, just simple yes or no. Have you met with the Assistant Secretary Bonzanto in OAWP to share your ideas for improving the whistleblower process?
No.
Yes, before she was received that current job officially.
I did in February.
Okay, very good. Ms. Jones. No, the yes or no's are over, okay. Go down the line more. Ms. Jones, in your written testimony, you reference OAWP statistics concerning the disciplinary rates of senior executives and senior leaders compared to the GS1 through GS6 category to suggest that the distribution is inequitable against the lower grades. What specific distribution of discipline does POGO believe would demonstrate equity, and how did you arrive at that number?
Well, I mean, I can't state a number specifically, but I would love to work with the VA in terms of figuring out best practices and how we can get there, and with this committee as well. But my priority would have been any change between 2014 and now. So my understanding, and part of the reason of standing up this office within the VA, was to change those numbers, to ensure that senior leaders were held accountable. But unfortunately, based on the numbers that you quoted, there hasn't been that change. And I believe that 0.1% represents only 7 individual cases of discipline against senior officials.
Well, you know, as we struggle with numbers, because sometimes you can look at total numbers or percentage of the population, and it's kind of like in some cases, you know, apples and oranges. So, you know, you've got, I think in the, at the SES level, you've got like 630 SES positions, so that's about 0.2% of the workforce, whereas the G1s through 6s, I think, are roughly 54% of the workforce. So we want to make sure that it's, if we look just at a raw number as opposed to a percentage, trying to get, you know, relative perspective on that. Is there an inequity or is there not? And also, again, Ms. Jones, you described what you referred to as a toxic culture in your dealings with former Acting Inspector General Richard Griffin in 2014. The current inspector, in general, Michael Missel, who's appeared before this committee several times, assumed the office in May of 16. What are your observations about the IG's conduct in the handling of whistleblower protection under Inspector General Missel, and do you believe that the IG has improved under his leadership? And feel free to expand on that.
Sure, absolutely. I was heartened to see the Inspector General willing to push back in access to documents from OAWP. You may recall there was a bit of a public spat that went on between the IG and the Secretary that I believe is since resolved. That's the kind of pushback that POGO likes to see from IGs, those who are independent and willing to investigate properly to make sure that things are operating as they should be. I understand that there has been recent complaints from whistleblowers about, I'm not sure if those are from the IG specifically or whether it's more broadly at the VA, but the IG may well be involved, that those whistleblowers have had their identities revealed to the agency. Now, I'm not sure of the IG's involvement in those cases. I think it would be a...
Well, your articulation of that, you know, again, when you have multiple agencies to report to interact with, it can be confusing at times. And anyway, thank you for your answers. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Cisneros.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. Ms. Jones, I want to kind of follow up on something you said regarding senior leadership and their disciplinary actions. I believe you said the senior leaders are permitted to investigate themselves and make their own determinations on those investigations, whether they're guilty or not. Or is that true at all facilities, or you know, whether it be a hospital, any VA facility, or is it? I mean, does it differ anywhere?
Well, that information comes from the GAO's report that came out, I believe, last year that looked at all VA whistleblower conduct. And it looked specifically at what has happened since OAWP has been stood up, the Office of OAWP. I can't speak to whether it's happening everywhere, but I mean, the line managers investigating themselves to misconduct, I mean, obviously that should be of a huge concern to veterans, to this committee, and to taxpayers, to be perfectly frank, in how rigorous those investigations are.
Ms. Garrick, you were kind of shaking your head as yes there. I mean, can you add to that answer? Or?
So as she's talking, just example after example is sort of popping into my head about people who have told me just that same thing, where they've gotten either the proposing official is the same person and the deciding official is been labeled in the corruption charges in the first place. So we don't see a lot of unbiased, independent investigations. These things all happen within the same chain of command. OAWP sends the letter to do the investigation right back to the facility. And this is, we've been talking a lot about the medical centers. This happens at the regional offices and at VBA as well. I mean, I see the same thing, that from the top down, it ends up going right back into the lap of the supervisor, who has been more likely than not, the perpetrator of the wrongdoing. So that's not fair and unbiased.
Right. And Ms. Garrick, I have a question for you. Something that you said in your testimony. You said the OWAP has no whistleblower policy. Can you expand on that?
Correct. So near as we've seen and we've asked a few times now to see a published policy, a policy statement, an employee handbook, something that delegates the roles and responsibilities, and we've not been nobody has shared that with us anyway. So if there is one, I'm unaware of it. But really something like a standard operating procedure, an SOP, that outlines roles, responsibilities, and helps to even manage some of these expectations. My understanding in like some of the data that reported that I've questioned is they say about 50% of the people that come to this office aren't whistleblowers. Well, who are they? Are they veterans? Are they patients? Are they family members? Are they volunteers? Who is that 50%? We have no key for that data to know even what they're reporting on. It just makes no sense. And they're not reporting on how they assist or what kind of retaliation they're documenting. I mean, if there's a laundry list of things I would love to see in a policy.
Okay. And my last question is just, what agency or government department out there would you say has a good, strong whistleblower program that the VA could probably emulate out there? Is there one?
Sir, we represent whistleblowers throughout the executive branch, and I'm not aware of such an animal. I believe the Office of Special Counsel has been making a good faith effort, but it's a relatively small office, just over 100 employees, to guard the merit system for the whole executive branch. And all they can do at most is kind of make a point in cases that are cut and dried, kind of low-hanging fruit, to send a message to the rest of the labor force. They don't have the resources to be a reliable source of protection. They are independent. We haven't seen a conflict of interest there, like all the internal VA structures. But we need a safety valve where whistleblowers at the VA and throughout the executive branch can have the same rights as corporate employees who blow the whistle on abuses of the public trust, to go to court and defend themselves in a jury trial against retaliation.
All right. With that, I yield back my time. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Radewagen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Devine, in your testimony, you refer to OAWP's mentoring program. How can this program help whistleblowers if it's reinstated? And conversely, how can this type of mediation potentially fall short? I believe you referenced the cases of Mr. Rodriguez and Mr. Wilkes as examples in your testimony.
The mentoring program either delivered some partial results or made a best effort to in a number of the cases that I discussed. The idea behind it is that as an alternative to litigation, OAWP would search out fresh starts for whistleblowers with managers who would welcome their perspective instead of being threatened by it. It really has some very effective initial results, and we don't know why OAWP canceled it, but I think it's very unfortunate. Our frustration with the mediation process has been at the Office of Special Counsel, which has tried to resolve disputes through negotiation. And I think the reason that it hasn't worked is that the Office of Special Counsel doesn't have the resources to hold those agencies accountable when they play games rather than in good faith trying to discuss a resolution. And so we've had too many experiences where they just kind of string out the process for 6 months to years in bad faith negotiations that prevent the whistleblowers from actually, the OSC, from investigating the wrongdoing or the whistleblowers from having a day in court. So instead of being a constructive alternative to conflict, it's ended up just sustaining it and spreading it out. There really needs to be accountability for this agency.
So ma'am, if I can add to that, Whistleblowers of America is a peer support program that I started because I was an Army social work officer. We've used peer support very successfully with dealing with combat vets, PTSD, suicidality, And so when I started Whistleblowers of America, it's using some of those evidence-based strategies to deal with these kinds of issues, building resilience, problem solving, that I think a mentorship program could really help VA employees work their way through this process and maybe eliminate some of the stress, what I call workplace traumatic stress. It could be really eliminated, and some of the damages that you're hearing people talk about that have happened to their psychosocial life, I think are the things we can maybe do a better job of as well, mitigate through a more organized, structured program.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Rice for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I believe this statistic that, Mr. Devine, you might have said that 30 to 40% of all whistleblower claims come from the VA.
Yes, ma'am.
So I think this kind of takes off on what my colleague, Mr. Cisneros, was asking. Who does it right? Who handles whistleblowers in the right way? Is there any federal agency that does? Or are they all handled the same way through the same pipeline?
Well, the structural problem is that whistleblowers in the civil service are primarily dependent upon remedial investigative agencies that don't have the resources to provide consistent relief. They can maybe do an in-depth investigation over a period of 1 to 2 years for 10% or less of the complaints that come in. And that's just token compared to the extent of retaliation. We need to restore credible due process rights. And the Merit Systems Protection Board, the administrative body that defends the merit system, currently is not functional and is many, many years from from healing. They haven't had a board that could issue final decisions in 3 years,
Why is
over
that?
2 years.
Why?
That's because the Senate blocked confirmation of appointments during the end of the Obama administration, and the Trump administration didn't make them. We
So
finally.
that's a fix. That's a potential fix.
Oh,
that could be made.
It's just paralyzed enforcement of the merit system. We're on the verge of getting a board again, but they have a 2,000 case backlog in the interim over that 2.5 years. And even that board is really kind of minor league due process compared to the access to court in jury trials that corporate whistleblowers have in every corporate whistleblower statute that's been passed in America since 2002. So we really have second-class enforcement, and even agencies like the Office of Special Counsel that I believe are making best efforts can only have token impact.
So would it be appropriate to put a time frame on how long a whistleblower investigation should take?
I'm sorry?
How long, you're saying these drag on, these investigations, when a whistleblower makes a claim. I mean, what is the optimum period of time that an investigation like this would take?
Well,
because it seems like the insinuation is that they drag it out and they drag it out for their own purposes and keep all of the whistleblowers in a state of perpetual limbo.
But I think they do that on purpose.
Well, that's what I'm
It's
asking.
intentional to drag it out, even though there are things that say there's 180 days or 240 days. They'll
So
go
those
beyond
are
that.
routinely being violated. There's no time frame.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because
okay.
here's the rub. The government has all the time in the world. Their attorneys are on they hire
They're
their
on
own
staff.
attorneys.
They're
They're
on
on
staff, right.
I mean, I went to an MSPB hearing. 5 government people showed up and 1 guy pro se. Most of the people I deal with end up pro se because it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to go out and hire a really good attorney.
No, it's totally skewed. There's no. Can I just ask you another question, Ms. Garrick? It seems to me crazy that
Yes.
the potential wrongdoers are the ones that ultimately are making the decision as to what happens with the whistleblowers.
Correct. And they're
How
funded by
can
the
that
government.
be? How can that? I mean, it seems to me like there should be a separate track of supervisors that assess a situation were not intimately involved in it and don't have a quote-unquote dog in the fight, although you could argue that anyone at VA has a dog in the fight of keeping this information from whistleblowers hidden. But how can we make that better? Because that is just a perversion of the whole system, it seems to me.
Well, and that's where I do believe there needs to be a lot more independence. And I mean, if you look at the budget for OSC versus OAWP, just OAWP's budget, and you compare it to the OSC budget, you'll see they're about the same when OSC has the workload for the entire federal government. So there's this disparity in how things get funded across the government, whether it's at the OSHA budget, the EEOC budget. So there's a lot of disparities in how the federal government funds these programs that are supposed to help all these whistleblowers. And there's no algorithm that says go here or go here, as opposed to sending you to 3 and 4 different places while you're out of pocket.
Yeah.
And you're on your own time, because you can't whistleblow on the government's dime. So, and there's very little help and support for that.
Congresswoman, the conflict of interest is perhaps most fundamental with OAWP. They should be an independent watchdog within the agency, but in practice, their decisions are controlled by the Office of General Counsel. Its mission is to defeat whistleblower claims. The conflict of interest could not be more hopeless, and OAWP needs to be freed.
Oh, these are all really great suggestions. I want to thank Mr. Chairman for holding this hearing, and I want to thank all of you. We need to get this right, because this is just, there are so many wrongs that are glaring, and there's no reason why we can't fix them. So I just want to thank you all, and I yield back.
Thank you. Well, I do want to thank each member of our panel for sharing their perspective with us today. It was really illuminating testimony that I know we have to continue to contend with as we move forward as a subcommittee, so I really appreciate your time. I do want to recognize General Bergman for a closing statement.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming, and the testimony, the questions, and the answers. This is an extremely important issue that we're dealing with here, to keep the environment open, to make sure that good people can get their voices heard and not be limited or inhibited. And I just wanted to, thank the chairman for keeping the hearing open and in recess at our request, the minority's request. And there's just the letter, the no job is complete until the paperwork is filed. But I just wanted to thank you in advance, and we have procedurally here to make sure that we get the second panel in here as soon as possible. And again, I thank the chairman for his agreeing to do that, and I yield back.
Well, thank you, General Bergman, and I absolutely agree. It's clear that this can't be the end of the conversation, and we need to move forward expeditiously to continue it, and I'm committed to doing that. I'd like to underscore the bipartisan nature of the work of this committee and the issues regarding whistleblowers. The subcommittee will hold additional hearings on the need for VA to listen from whistleblowers and protect their rights, and as I alluded to earlier, we will hold this hearing open. I think it's clear today that all the whistleblowers who have stepped forward are doing an incredible service to our veterans. So on behalf of the subcommittee, I want to thank the 3 individuals who appeared on the first panel for all of their work and for being with us here today. Under the committee rule 3C-F5, the minority witness panel will appear subject to the call of the chair. The committee will remain in recess until such time.